Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the next edition of the Monday Majlis, and it's the second of the first mini series in that series, and it is which is dedicated to Kalīla wa-Dimna, namely to that magnificent project of which many of you are aware, especially those who were here last week. Project designed by Professor Beatrice Grundler, who was with us last week, and who has a wonderful team. And two members of the team are here today, Johannes and Theo. And I will change the usual habit that I advertise the next talk at the end of this one. I will put already here in the chat the next talks, because that will be the continuation and the last of the series. So Johannes is in that team, and I had the joy to meet him on a webinar some years ago, and then we also met in person, and I was always in each occasions I was deeply impressed by his scholarship. So I will give the word to him to talk about his journey, and then about his current research.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you all hear me very well? And does it work? Is that loud enough? Okay, looks like. Yeah, thank you so much, Istvan, for this kind introduction, and for also organizing this very interesting lecture series, and for giving us enough room to present different perspectives on this very rich, as I call it, tradition, literary tradition, that is not only, I think, fundamental in Arabic literature, it's also important, as you know now, of course, to world literature, broadly speaking, and still under-researched to a large extent. And yeah, again, I'm very happy that I'm here today, and I can share with you some of my insights and ideas. And in the beginning, as it is the usual practice of the Majlises, I shall say a few words about myself. I hope to keep it brief, and then try to find a way to give a first introduction then to my talk. So where does my journey start? I would say that there are different possible beginnings, of course, for this journey. Actually, similarity to Kalīla and Dimna, that has many beginnings. I think that one beginning is in Jordan. That was now almost 20 years ago, when I first got in sort of real life contact with the Arabic language, me being 19 or 20 years old and trying to learn colloquial Arabic, and which really fascinated me. And this is how I actually seriously got in touch with Arabic. Before that, there were just attempts to learn the alphabet and to decipher words, and to prepare myself for that stay in Jordan, which actually was some volunteering work in a boarding school in Amman. And that led me to study Arabic out of that curiosity, to just being fascinated by the liveliness and the vastness of this language. To continue this, and also an interest in non-European context, which I felt I was always interested in literature and its connection to history. And I thought I want to move out of this rather restricted European focus. Of course, there's also enough to study, but it was simply a curiosity to go beyond that. And then I studied Islamwissenschaft, Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, with the interest of understanding modern societies first. And with a political interest also, to understand how societies are composed, how they function. And then it was a longer process of transition toward a more philological and literary interest. Toward the end of my studies, and that was back in the time in Switzerland, during my master's studies, I was interested in understanding the modern order of societies, and the knowledge order also of societies. And that I did through the study of concepts. And this was part of my master thesis to understand, for example, the concept of civilization, tamadun. And one cannot really study the modern discourse of the 19th century without also coming across the concept of adab, of literature, which is very significant, of course, in the 19th century, as you know. And also the genre that is very fitting and very helpful to understand the discourse of modernity in Arab societies are travelogues. And because you can see their continuity, of course, from the classical or late classical tradition, if you will, to the 19th century, that people wrote about their travels. And then I realized that there was not much research done, especially on travelogues that are from the early modern period. So slightly then during my late studies, I went back toward the 18th century, and that was then the topic of my dissertation, to understand travelogues from the early modern period. And that is why I then at some point came across this, at that time known to be anonymous, travelogue by Hannah Diab, which I have also edited and which came out of the Library of Arabic Literature, and which is a very fascinating text because it is, as we would usually say, a popular narrative, a popular work, although there is a certain eloquence in the sense of linking different impressions with different types of narratives, with own memories. Actually, the text reads very much like an autobiography, and its primary significance, of course, at first sight comes from the fact that Hannah Diab was the muse of Antoine Galland, the first translator of the Arabian Nights into the European language, as he provided those stories that we know as the orphan stories until today. And I think the name probably will change soon, because we know now that Hannah Diab obviously existed and was also himself a writer and someone who most likely also owned other texts, copied them or had them copied for him, and had a little library. But these texts were rather of the Christian dimension, a strongly Catholic, at the time modern dimension, I would say. What he wrote in his travelogue is a different type of text. What is significant about it, and this leads me more to the literariness of it, is that it is a frame narrative. It is a text that embeds at least one dozen, of stories that are rendered as quoted speech. That is, he encounters on his journey other travelers, often other Catholics from the Near East, often recently converted, and he recounts their stories. There are also a few other stories. Often they are of a hagiographic or pseudographic nature. And I think that this form, this embedding of narratives, is very much conveying more than just an aesthetic pleasure. It conveys also a meaning. And I think the meaning has to do with an embedding of the person into his social environment, into a certain milieu, into also a certain history that at that time, and this is, I think, typical for late pre-modern also, for let's say for pre-modern, but I think also for late pre-modern, that history still consists of collecting stories and bringing them together. And I think this is one of the many practices that are so intriguing in that travelogue. So I felt that one has to study this text from a literary perspective in order to make sense of it. Also for the fact that the text is very much presented like an autobiography and I think in the strict sense, because he reflects on his life as a young traveler, being an old writer. He writes his text more than 50 years later. And so this is a literary interest. I could say much more about this, but this is a literary interest from the one hand. And on the other, there's also the linguistic variety of this text that is clearly a Middle Arabic text, very much using a Latin dialect. Many things are known from Syrian dialects today also that one can encounter in this text. And there are the very typical Middle Arabic features which show that this text is also part of written culture. It's not just a record of some oral account. It interacts with most likely other written texts at the time. So having that expertise of Middle Arabic and this interest in connecting form and content in the study of literature, I joined then the team of Amnon Classic to study yet older narrative materials, and that is Kalīla and Dimna, of course, in the first place. And one of my main activities in that regard, apart from also pursuing the interest in understanding the variety of Arabic, is to look at the readers, as I call them, of Kalīla and Dimna, to understand who read the text, in what way, and for what purpose. And I knew that the text was mentioned, Kalīla and Dimna, as if I want to call it text. Kalīla and Dimna was mentioned, but I didn't know the scope of it. So you find, and you will see it in one slide, you see later, you will see so many authors that refer to Kalīla and Dimna. And I think that's, to begin with, I think simply very fascinating, because in the same time, I see this text in a close connection to other so-called more popular narratives that are not so often mentioned, like the Arabian Nights simply, or the Sinbad-name, who don't appear that often in the literary reception. But Kalīla and Dimna was a text that was interesting to Udaba and beyond that, and clearly Ibn Muqaffa, as you know, also belongs to that milieu of early Kutab and Udaba. So this, I think, was what sort of paves the ground for some of the aspects that I will present today. Maybe in a nutshell, what I find really important is the link between form and content, that form should not be seen as something to be isolated from content as an aesthetic device simply, but it also creates meaning. And I hope that in my talk that comes across to some extent, maybe in the end of it, and if not, we can maybe think about it afterwards. Maybe a few words before I start. I owe also some thanks to Istvan, who had listened to a previous version of this talk, which I gave last year. I extended a bit, I changed a few things, but many of the findings I have presented before. What I owe him is that I looked a bit more closely at Kalīla and Dimna itself, especially Ibn Muqaffa's introduction, and I think there's much more to get out. Most of this, what I present today, is still preliminary. I'm preparing publications related to this, but yes, I hope to share this work in progress with you in a few seconds, and I hope you will enjoy the talk and have critical questions or different insights.
Go ahead, please, Johannes. We are all excited to hear.
So yeah, I will share my screen. I will just. I hope that this works. Sorry.
We can see numbers. We can see us. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the title of my talk is Kalīla and Dimna and the Anthological Epistemology of Adab. So what I will present today is part of my ongoing research. As I said, I try to understand Kalīla and Dimna's transmission, and particularly the use of its wisdom sayings, similes, and parables in historiographical, anthological, literary, and philosophical works. And this is what we could call the indirect transmission of the text. So there's the main transmission through manuscripts, full book versions, if you will, and then here through snippets, quotes, reference to the book. The book has been mentioned and cited in numerous anthologies, and as I said, historiographical works, especially during the first centuries of its existence in Arabic. And there's probably no known author from the Arabo-Islamic tradition that does not at least mention it as an important book, use one or many of its maxims, or refer to it in any different way. And to study this can be useful when aiming to reconstruct the book and fill a gap in the textual history of Kalīla and Dimna. For Ibn Muqaffa had translated the book, as you know, most likely in the beginning of the 8th or 2nd century, according to the Islamic calendar. However, first full manuscripts of Kalīla wa-Dimna are dated to the 13th century. The Hagia Sophia manuscript is from the 1220s AD, which is the basis of Abdul Wahab Azam's edition from 1941. And the activity of making editions started, of course, during the turn to the 19th century with Sylvestre de Sacy, and is an ongoing practice. In 2021, Michael Fishbein added an edition based on another manuscript, and Beatrice Grundler and her team are preparing the first synoptic edition of Kalīla and Dimna chapters, containing several variant manuscripts from the whole period of the full text transmission, the 13th to the 19th centuries. So between the early 8th century and the first manuscript, there's a historical gap of about 500 years, which everybody studying Arabo-Islamic text, of course, is not so unfamiliar. I think it's not the only text that would have this gap, but given that Ibn Muqaffa is one of the very early sort of witnesses to Arabic prose activities, if you want to call it like this, this gap is quite huge. And tackling this gap is what I do in my research. And considering, so this is in this gap, we have a lot of reference to the book. This is the important point. So considering this substantial amount of citations from Kalīla wa-Dimna from these centuries in various anthological works during this period, I have two aims. So the first is philological in the basic meaning of philology. My attempt is to reconstruct Kalīla and Dimna. How did Kalīla and Dimna look like in the classical period? And is it even possible to sort of come to a conclusion how it looked like? The second is interpretive. How is the book used, and what does this tell us about intertextuality in adab works? More specifically, I will examine the relationship between Kalīla and Dimna and early adab anthologies. And this opens up a set of questions, which I will tackle today. These are four. So how did authors or readers, as I call them, refer to Kalīla and Dimna? Then what do they quote from it? How is Kalīla wa-Dimna integrated into these anthological works? And four, what does this intertextuality actually imply? What does it signify? My argument will be that Kalīla and Dimna is not to be seen as one text, but as a tradition that has its own logic of variation. That means that variation is not only an outcome of a pre-modern transmission process or creative appropriations due, for example, to the taste of copyists. It is rather an embedded attitude to ordering knowledge. And this is what I will call, with this neologism, the anthological epistemology. And this consists of two main aspects. One is the associative analogical thinking that is part of it, and the other is seeking completeness while never really achieving it. Before unpacking my argument through addressing the four questions I just outlined, I shall first turn to the scope of the references and their importance in order to understand what Kalīla and Dimna is. So what are the references? Among the multiple references to the book of Kalīla and Dimna, and of course, as I showed before, these go beyond these 500 years, but also because of the editions that are available, mostly from that classical period, which is a practical reason, it's easier to access actually this early period, but also this is what I focus on in order to understand sort of as Beatrice Grundler called it last week, the dark age, before we have access to actual manuscripts. So one can identify different modes of how the book appears in other works. And one is here, the first one is quotations, paraphrases, which I will mainly focus on. Famous examples are Ibn Qutayba. One could also think of Miskawayh and many others. The second are accounts of the text history and some sort of textual criticism, such as in Al-Yaqubi's Tarikh, very early historiography, and in Al-Biruni's ethnography of India. Then we have comments on the specific status or function of the text. And these are apart from the general adab category. This can be found in commentaries to the Quran, and it can be found in philosophical works, for example, in the commentaries to Aristotle's Poetics and Rhetoric. And finally, different adaptations of story material and motifs. Obviously, some of the works can be classified under more than one of these four modes, and the one mode that I shall focus on is the first one. Some of these works that I will look into, or that I will shortly mention, have maybe only one quote, but others have dozens of them, and seem to have extensive knowledge of the Kalīla and Dimna tradition. In the following, I shall focus on the most substantial references to Kalīla and Dimna in the first centuries of its use. I chose early anthologists who compiled their works in the 3rd to early 5th centuries of Islam, that is between the 9th and early 11th centuries, more or less, and those that quote more than 10 times from Kalīla and Dimna, as far as we know. So I will look at the Uyun al-Akhbar, which is a very important work when talking about the history of Kalīla and Dimna, written by the Kufan polymath Ibn Qutayba during the, this was still during the 3rd century, or to turn to the 9th century. Then the Iqt al-Farid, the unique necklace, by Ibn Abd Rabbihi from Andalus, a bit later. Finally, I will also look at Tawhidis al-Basar wa Dakhair, Insights and Treasures. He was a philosopher from the 10th century. And if time allows, I will also include the Book of Similes by Ibn Abi'un, which is a bit more a specific anthology, because here the focus is on comparisons in different genres. And this is a book that was meant to serve poetry and poetic imagination. And then Nathar ad-Dur, which by Al-Abi was written a bit later in the most likely in the early 11th century, which is also an anthology of all kinds of things. I will also probably tackle a little bit that text. Here, Kalīla and Dimna actually is mentioned in one specific chapter, as it is also in Kitab al-Tashbihat, the Book of Similes. So how do authors refer to Kalīla and Dimna? Ibn Qutayba is one of the very early authors, mentioning Kalīla and Dimna more than 56 times, Ibn Abd Rabbihi 21 times, and Al-Abi 17, At-Tawhidi and Ibn Abi'un 13 times. The guiding principle of these authors seems rather similar. Without providing any historical context, they introduce mostly rather short quotations or parables from Kalīla and Dimna, along all kinds of other materials from the Islamic tradition and from previous pre-Islamic traditions. It is important to note here that all of the authors, when introducing such quotes, they do not necessarily refer to the known title, the Book of Kalīla and Dimna. Especially Ibn Qutayba and Ibn Abd Rabbihi, among the earliest reference to Kalīla and Dimna, refer way more often to a book by the Indians. And this is established in research. Many scholars mention that already. So it's a book by the Indians. It can be sort of the Indian book, the book from India, or it can be like any book from India. And also actually in Al-Tawhidi's book, one can discern two references to a book from India, which are clearly also known from Kalīla and Dimna. So here are like various ways wisdom taken out of Kalīla and Dimna was referred to. So it has been suggested that the different titles may refer to different versions, different books, and that I think is possible. But what is also possible is that the book was simply known under different titles. There are also early manuscripts, at least I have one in mind, from the 13th or 14th century that actually mentions Kalīla and Dimna in its incipit as the book from India. So it was known clearly as Indian wisdom and associated with that. Sometimes, and I think that's also an interesting observation, a quote mentioned as belonging to the book of the Indians, for example, by Ibn Qutayba, is elsewhere rendered as being known from Kalīla wa-Dimna. So there's no consistency in using certain quotes as being from Kitab Kalīla wa-Dimna and other quotes belonging to Kitab min Kutub al-Hind, for example. And this also happens clearly in the Basair by al-Tawhidi, who himself acknowledges his use of Ibn Qutayba's work. And I think this is another important dimension, that scholars used other anthologies in which Kalīla wa-Dimna already appears to compose their own, most likely. Although then, which is always sort of, I mean, not really surprising, but something that can lead to some disappointment, that actually, if you try to reconstruct the sources, that actually every author has yet other quotes from Kalīla wa-Dimna. This would be the case for Tawhidi, who clearly had other sources than Ayun al-Akhbar, who also most likely simply had Kalīla wa-Dimna, or maybe other extracts from it. And I mean, it's of course very likely that Tawhidi himself read Kalīla wa-Dimna a few times and that he knew it well, since he was also a polymath figure at his time. In fact, actually also other authors like Ibn Battah al-Uqbari, he recites directly from Ibn Qutayba's citations of the work. The fact that Kalīla and Dimna was known under different titles can be also confirmed by Ibn Nadim, who alludes to, in his Fihrist, to an awareness of different versions, and that there was sort of a discussion if this is actually really Indian, and he mentions the specific length of the book according to the many chapters in it, in the version of Ibn Muqaffa, and so he makes it clear there were other versions that he knew at least, and he also mentions extracts and other collections from the content of Kalīla and Dimna, to say the least. And so Kalīla and Dimna did not obviously exist in one version, but very early on in multiple versions. Ibn Nadim writes a bit later than, for example, Ibn Atrabihi and Ibn Qutayba. He writes at a period when the textual criticism toward the work by Ibn Muqaffa can be discerned in different texts among different authors. And this is the turn to the 11th century. One can see that with al-Yamani, who is one of the authors that just in that long list, who is also very important to reconstruct how the text might have looked like. I have excluded him now from this study, as his take is rather specific, and he doesn't write like a broader adab anthology, but he really writes some sort of commentary, a meta text to Kalīla and Dimna. So they are opposing views to the actual origin of the text during the beginning of the 11th century. More important now for me is that already in these multiple references which we can see in these anthologies, that there is variation. This is the key word here. So let us see how this variation is not only applied in referring to the book, but also how different readers use Kalīla and Dimna and quotes from it differently now. Here we have one quote from Ibn Atrabihi's Elect al-Farid. The resolute man is wary of his enemy in any case. He's wary of an attack when he comes closer, and his return when he moves further away, and of an ambush when he's seen, and a faint flight when he turns away, and a strike when he runs. So this first quote that I present here is from the chapter of the Owls and the Crows, very typical for it, because it is about warfare, basically, or about how do you discern an enemy and know the difference between enemy and a friend, and these and related topics. And this is just one example how such a quote can look like. So some of these quotes are sort of sound like a wisdom saying as an advice without a simile. as in the form described above, for instance. But the overwhelming majority of the 120 quotes that I'm looking at for today are hikam, wisdom sayings that contain a short simile, tashbih, you could say. So of the following kind: the king's friend is like a lion's rider. One would not know when he will be enraged and kill him. It is actually as you will see later, that in Abd al-Farid, quotes tend to be longer than these short ones. And that this anthology, more than any other work I'm quoting from Kalīla and Dimna, contains longer narrative passages. Mostly in these anthologies, the passages are rather short. Often they are 1 or 2 sentences, and they portray, as I've just shown, this type of similes that have this length of this or the previous one, which is a bit longer. In most cases, the specific source of the wisdom sayings can be discerned. So I show you this. I'm showing you this chart here, which is an extract from my long list of quotes, and I'm using the abbreviations known from de Blois' book, Bourgeois' Voyage. So one can see here which chapters are actually used, most likely. I mean, I just assume that the chapters in the content remain so stable that the wisdom sayings remain in their place in the chapters. And I think this assumption makes sense, as the chapters, most of them, have a very clear-cut definition of their topic. So one can, as I just mentioned it also for the Owls and the Crows, say that this is typically a topic of the Owls and the Crows. It could appear maybe in a different chapter, but it's likely that it was known from the Owl and Crow chapter also. And so here one can see that one can identify from which chapters different authors quote, and also which chapters may have been part of the book of Kalīla and Dimna as it was known at the time, or one of the prevalent versions at the time. In the case of the mentioned 5 works here, the authors quote from 10 different chapters. They all make use of the long chapters, mostly of the Lion and the Ox, the Owls and the Crows, and also of the Ringdove. And some, as you can also see here, do quote from, besides these 3 chapters, do quote also from the preface by Bourgeois. And I think that's actually interesting. Ibn Qutayba does not. So I think that what chapter they refer to, especially when they anyway, like Ibn Qutayba, quote so often from Kalīla wa Dimna, is indicative of the version of Kalīla wa Dimna they must have had in front of them. In other words, what they understand as belonging to the book from India, or the book of Kalīla and Dimna. Al-Tawhidi mentions this book, this chapter by Bourgeois as the 2nd chapter, Fasl, of Kalīla wa Dimna, which, according to an anecdote he inserts, was of certain use at the court. So he saw that as intrinsic part of Kalīla and Dimna and did not see it as something that is just a paratext added to it. And this is actually important and reflects very much how this chapter was treated. It's, I think, to some extent different than the other prefaces, which, according to my knowledge so far, don't appear in the indirect transmission, don't have references to it. But this one has, and it's also put as simply a chapter, for example, in the versifications, the Arabic versifications of Kalīla and Dimna, that also appear very early, but fairly early. But we have only access to later manuscripts of versifications stemming from the, I think, 11th century. It makes absolute sense to quote from Bourgeois' chapter. It has a lot of hikam and amthal. Of course, the tone of the chapter and its critique of a certain epistemology, and some people would say a critique or criticism toward religion in some way, could have led also to an exclusion of this chapter in certain anthologies. That's possible, but that's something to think more about. So also again about the connection of these different anthologies. It has been claimed that Ibn Abd-Rabbi made use of Uyun al-Akhbar in the case of quotes from the Indian book. Ibn Abd-Rabbi, the Cordoban writer, must have used, at least for many cases, though, a different source. And this also is shown by other scholars, by Werkmeister, for example, in his book in which he talks about the sources of Al-Aqd al-Farid. Among his 21 quotes, only 8 overlap with references to Uyun al-Akhbar. And even within this group of quotes, there are a few differences as to how they are exactly rendered in Arabic. And this you can see, for example, in this quote. There's no characteristic that a rich man is praised for that does not blame the poor man. When he's brave, he's called reckless. When he's serious, he's called stupid. When he's eloquent, he's called talkative. And when he's silent, he's called unintelligible. And this is from Uyun al-Akhbar. And then Ibn Abd-Rabbi, he extended it, or he had a different version of it, so that he uses not only different words sometimes than Ibn Qutayba, but also has more examples of how a poor man is treated, as you can see here. And actually, this is also, and this again, as I said before, is typical for him, that he used longer quotes, longer passages from Kalīla and Dimna, and this rather short wisdom saying is included in this longer quote in Kalīla wa-Dimna. So considering the use of different chapters and some variation in the quotes, as I have shown now, between different authors, we can draw that there was no clear consensus what actually belonged to Kalīla wa-Dimna in all its semantic details or linguistic nuances. It is, again, likely that the different authors had different versions at their disposal, or quote from both the actual book of Kalīla and Dimna and other anthologies. And as to the reception of quotes within single works, the variance may be intended, because the quotes from Kalīla and Dimna can fit in different contexts. I will come back to this later in the context of Ibn Qutayba's work and its rationale. The aspect of quoting from Kalīla and Dimna in various ways, I suggest, is not only due to the versions these authors had. Of course, it may sometimes be a coincidence for the anthologists like At-Tawhidi use such a broad spectrum of sources. But obviously, one can also note, I argue, that this variation is also due to appropriating the material through paraphrasing and intervening in the style of these quotations. I would like to suggest there is something more to this, something intrinsic to the way knowledge is ordered in Arab works. So let me move to my last point, the significance of using Kalīla and Dimna the way I have just described. So here I will restrict myself for this talk today to Ibn Qutayba's work, which I think is fundamental for understanding the interaction of Kalīla and Dimna with the broader Arab tradition. And in the end, then I will also return briefly to Ibn Muqaffa and his preface. Ibn Qutayba's Uyun consists of 10 parts or books, kutub, of varying length. And Kalīla wa-Dimna quotes appear in all chapters except the books of asceticism, book 5, food and women, as far as I've studied them so far. Most quotes can be found in the books on the ruler. This is book number 1, the book on leadership, book number 3, and needs, book number 8. The anthology combines topics that are of principal importance to the political life at the court, especially in the first 3 chapters, on which deal with the topics of power and animosity, warfare, and ranks, leadership in society, and as well as more general topics related to human relationships and different forms of knowledge. Overall, the emphasis on wisdom concerning rulership, power, and warfare, which is mostly concerned with understanding the logic of animosity, as well as knowing the right conduct in different settings, all virtues are related to human relationships. All these are also topics perfused in Kalīla wa-Dimna. So now I shall finally look at the overall modus operandi of the adab anthologies and have to again, as I said, restrict myself to Ibn Qutayba. He's concerned with illuminating his contemporaries, specifically those fellows at the court that do not know enough in his view. For those fellows, as for every human being, knowledge and ethics should not be restricted to knowing what is permissible and forbidden, halal and haram, as the good, al-khair, is much more expensive and requires imparting of all types of knowledge. Al-turuq ilayhi kathira wa abwab al-khair wasi'a. The paths to him, God, are manifold, and the gates to goodness are wide. He states explicitly that he aimed to include knowledge from previous traditions, and this is something that also Ibn Abdrabihi and Al-Tuhiri and others do. And then it makes sense, of course, to include Kalīla and Dimna as an Indian book, Indian wisdom, into a scope of Arabo-Islamic scholarship. In Ibn Qutayba's understanding, these different types of knowledge are meant to foreground the good. And despite the variation, they carry similitude, mushakala, and the wisdom they are meant to convey. Hence, knowledge and wisdom always contain an expansive dimension, in Ibn Qutayba's view. Knowledge can always grow. And a maxim, one teaching, one account can build up on another one by means of a cognitive connection. In addition to this, the meaning, ma'na, of an account or a saying, as Ibn Qutayba explicitly says later, can be associated with different fields of knowledge. And that means different chapters of this book. And thus these teachings, these accounts or these wisdom sayings are multidimensional. And this adab as the ideal behavior in certain situations is mentioned and is a category of practical wisdom for the learned man, essential to a good life and of relevance for life in this world and the afterlife. So here, sorry, maybe it's coming now a bit late. This is how he explains the order of his book. Sorry, no, actually. Yeah, it is. Sorry, I'm seeing different slides here. So this is how he explains the organization of his book. He says that he combined a chapter with a comparable one, or you could say also associated or linked a chapter to a comparable one, and a report with a similar one, and a word, I'm still quoting Ibn Qutayba, with its synonym in order to make the message easy for the learner to learn, for the student to memorize, and for the researcher to seek. I think this aspect is very important. It's, of course, mainly an organizational remark, but he mentions also different possible readers that he may have in mind. And he also mentions how knowledge is associated, how certain discourses of knowledge are associated with others. And he says it when he goes on in his introduction to al-Akhbar, also that, of course, it is about linking poetry to prose accounts and show that there are similar meanings. So Ibn Qutayba used his skills to select and compose poetry and reports in order to make them easier to understand. Through drawing analogies, he expands the meaning of all the snippets he uses in his work. As such, his logic of compilation resonates, in my view, with Ibn Muqaffa's preface to Kalīla and Dimna, which brings me now to the aspect of the anthological epistemology, as I call it, and my conclusion at the same time. Kalīla and Dimna, as you've seen, is a fluid tradition, a text that can be appropriated and adjusted to different contexts. It becomes obvious when looking at the early readers of Kalīla and Dimna that the content of the book varied, also before the 13th century, heavily. Some chapters known today were not already part of the tradition. This is a different topic, but which I didn't mention in detail, but one can see that. Also, the way the book was known varied, as I have shown with the different titles to the book. Traces of this variety can also be observed in the anthologies when the same passage is changed or extended. The mode of dealing with wisdom from different sources is also presented by Ibn Qutayba, who presents his expansive and associative take on anthologizing, which tries to possibly address different readers. Ibn Muqaffa, now the translator into Arabic, presents Kalīla and Dimna based on Indian wisdom as a book that requires careful reading, as it contains a superficial layer, if you will, of meaning, of which, of course, entertainment, this was mentioned last time, Hazal, can be part, and of a deeper understanding expressed by, for example, a nut to crack, or by the hidden sense, batin. And later in his preface, he states, and this translation is based on the one provided by Fishbein and Montgomery, one should increase the practice of drawing analogies and benefit from experiences and beware of things that harm him and of things similar to those. Measure one against the other in order to be aware of one thing as a result of your experience with something else. So in the translation, what is a bit tricky is the way he refers, he addresses the reader here in some way, and also wants to make it sound as general as possible. And he's here in a specific discourse about cautioning, like it's about careful reading. It's about making use of the knowledge you gained. Every knowledge that is not used is sort of not useful for you. It can be even problematic. And here he's clearly talking about a tajarub, which are important. Experience is important in importance, in gaining wisdom. And so that means that wisdom always has to be adjusted. Learned wisdom has to always be adjusted to the situation. He urges his reader here to practice in analogical reasoning and to associate or compare one experience to another, to draw wisdom from it. He does not only, however, say this, he also exercises this very practice in his preface, in the way he presents his topic, in which he tackles the topics of careful reading and the necessity of applying knowledge to circumstances in real life. Again and again, he refers to different wisdom sayings, but more importantly, analogical stories that illustrate his main points. And these main points lead him to new stories. And he sort of presents an associative or a chain of associations that lead him from one aspect to another. This mode, I would say, is not narrative in the strict sense, because it functions based on association. So that's why I think this mode is anthological. It provides an ordering principle in which different topics are connected through cognitive associations, not through a shared story world. This also, I suggest, can be seen in anthologies like the Uyun, where different sources of knowledge are juxtaposed. A rhyme with a Quranic verse, with, for example, a saying from Ibn Muqaffa and Bozok Meher, and then a saying from Kalīla wa Dimna. And I think this awaits further studies. I hope I will have the time to carry that out, to study other anthologies, to what extent they also apply this rationale of linking different sources of knowledge and thus expanding certain topics. And of course, Kalīla wa Dimna itself, in its different chapters, in the known animal fables that are all, most of them, frame stories, also provides this associative thinking in which one narrative, or the ethical scope of one narrative is expanded through embedding stories, in which different possibilities of seeing a matter, of reacting to a certain aspect, to, for example, a certain threat in the chapter of the crows and the owls, or to an intrigue in the chapters of the lion and the ox, and so on. The fact that Kalīla and Dimna is not a book that can be seriously completed and turned into one authoritative text, the fact that it is fluid and hence rather a textual tradition or a narrative tradition or an anthological tradition than a book in any modern sense is rooted in a practice to connect knowledge to previously existing snippets of wisdom and to adjust it to actual human experience again and again. This seeking of multiple connections through analogical reasoning in both compiling wisdom in writing and in actual practice, and the constant seeking of completion, and be it only for a short moment, is part of the anthological epistemology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes, indeed. And then, yeah, it's very interesting. I heard that, as I said, I heard a previous version, and it's still very interesting to hear. And if I will hear it again, it will be because yes, it's this way of how we use literature and how it is meant to be used. Yeah. Anyway, I will be silent, and I will invite for questions. While you are gathering your questions, I just wonder whether Theo, could you say a couple of words on how you will build just as an invitation for the next one, is as I put it up already yours.
Sure. So yeah, next week I plan on talking about the theme of prosometrum, or at least in a general sense, the idea of the Persian version of Kalīla and Dimna, written in the 12th century, translated in the 12th century by Nasrullah Munshi. The idea of that text as a work of a kind of prosometrum. And I know that the boundaries of the term prosometrum are hardly universally agreed upon, and it could really be argued that it is primarily a prose version of Kalīla and Dimna, which I would agree with, that just has sort of on the high side of an admixture of poetry that he weaves into the narrative repeatedly. But that's what I want to focus on, that we have this 12th century, highly influential Persian prose translation of Kalīla and Dimna from the Arabic. But at the same time that this translator, who was working at the Ghaznavid court in the sort of eastern side of the Persianate world, at the same time that he's translating Kalīla and Dimna from Arabic into Persian, he then stuffs a whole bunch of new material back into the text. And interestingly enough, a good deal of the new material that he puts back in is in fact in Arabic. So we end up with a translation of Kalīla and Dimna from Arabic into Persian, which then becomes an effectively bilingual version of Kalīla and Dimna because of the amount of Arabic lines of poetry that he weaves into the stories, copious quotation of Quranic verses and ahadith, even anecdotes from histories of the caliphs. And I've spoken at various conferences and workshops about different kind of angles on this text. And one that I haven't focused on to a great deal yet is Nasrullah's use of poetic material. And so I want to talk about that next week, and I'd like to show some pages from different manuscripts and how they dealt with the incorporation of poetry into this again, mainly prose, but almost at the point of becoming prosometrical version of Kalīla and Dimna. So that's what I'll talk about next week. And there's one manuscript in particular that I've used for the flyer image where, again, a lot of the poetry is in Arabic, and we have indications even from an early period that it was difficult for people to read the Arabic poetry who were approaching this maybe as a Persian version of Kalīla and Dimna, only to be met with a large amount of classical Arabic verse, which is not necessarily easy to read. So there's an early manuscript actually here at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, where all of the Arabic poetry has been given interlinear, very literal Persian translation. So that's probably the manuscript that I'll show the most leaves from next week. And yeah, so one part of it is prosametrum, but it's also, there's always this issue of translating Kalīla and Dimna, but also doing funny things with it. And I'm sure there will be opportunities for me to link in my discussion of that text with Johannes's very astute observations on even looking like within the Arabic tradition, just how complicated the status of this book is, or if we're even going to call it a book, let alone when this Arabic version begins to have an international, or I guess we could say global reach and influence of its own, and gets translated into further languages, that all of these complications that already exist within the Arabic tradition of the manuscripts and reading of Kalīla wa-Dimna are only compounded as it moves into Persian or other languages that we could look at. So I do hope to relate my ideas also to what Johannes has presented. But yeah, that's for next week. I don't want to distract from the Q&A of what Johannes has just shared with us.
Thank you very much, Theo. And then it links, really, Johannes's talk was such a beautiful presentation of how the text and it lives in many ways, and how the ideas of in it live in other texts. Yeah, and why it is so fascinating to study this book or this tradition, and what different people make of it. Yeah, you focused on Ibn Qutayba, but I assume you present the take of other authors as well, and that is fascinating indeed. So I will stop the recording, and let's go into the discussions part of, and again once thank you also, Johannes, for being so much on time. That allowed us to have Theo's introduction for next week as well. Thank you.